out there. So you are welcome to Success Biochemistry Academy. This is our maiden and our first lecture. So I welcome you to this platform. On this platform, we will be discussing biochemistry topics comprehensively. We look at the pros and the cons of biochemistry topics, and we try as much as possible to do in-depth explanation of biochemical principles. For our platform here, we'll be doing video lectures. We'll also be incorporating it with PowerPoint presentation and for our teaching, just for explicit explanation of biochemical concepts. So like I said earlier on, it's our first lecture, so I hope you will enjoy as you learn along with us in this lecture. Our first topic for this will be Introductory Fundamentals and Foundations of Biochemistry. We decided to start with this topic because we discovered that biochemistry is a topic that students more often than not dread, and we don't want this trend. So therefore we decide to look at the foundations and the fundamentals of biochemistry. We'll be building on what you've known so far from biology and chemistry concepts. So we'll build on that, and we try as much as possible to lay a solid foundation for your biochemistry knowledge. Thanks as you watch along. So Introductory Fundamentals and Foundation of Biochemistry. So let's look at our course outline. First and foremost, like I said, we'll be building on the knowledge of what you have known from biology and chemistry in your college days. So our course outline will look like this. First of all, we look at atom. What is an atom? And we do a review of what an atom is and the atomic theory. Then we look at the cell. Then we do a brief revision on the cell theory. Then we look at the evolution of the universe from the eruption of inorganic subatomic particle. Thereafter, we move to the source and nature of what must have been the first living cell, because we'll be looking at living cell from the simplest to the most advanced or to the most complex. So we try to look what will the first living cell must have looked like, because we'll be looking at a lead about chemical and biochemical evolution. So after that, we'll be looking at what exactly is biochemistry. What do biochemists study? What is biochemistry? Then we look at biochemically relevant properties of living things. Thereafter, we move to fundamentals and foundations of biochemistry. Here we'll be looking at about 5 things. We'll be looking at various foundations on which biochemistry as a concept and as a course is laid. We'll be looking at the biological or cellular foundation of biochemistry. We'll be looking at the chemical foundation of biochemistry. We'll be looking at the physical foundation of biochemistry. We'll be looking at the evolutionary foundation of biochemistry. And last but not the least, we'll be looking at the genetic foundation of biochemistry. Foremost scientist John Dalton gave us a summary of what an atom is, what we should expect in an atom, and what an atom should behave like. So first of all, let's do a review of that. First of all, you know that an atom, first of all, that's the first atomic theory, that an atom is the smallest indivisible particle of an element which can stand in isolation and still retain the chemical property of such elements. I'll go through that again, that an atom is the smallest indivisible particle of an element which can stand in isolation and retain the chemical property of such element. For instance, if I have the element of a potassium, say I have 5 grams of potassium, and I continue to divide and I divide and I divide, I will divide until I can divide no longer. Then I have an atom of my potassium. At that ultra divisible state, at that ultra division state, pardon me, the potassium atom, if it is truly a potassium atom, must still retain the chemical property and the chemical validity of what potassium is in chemical structure and in activity. Secondly, is that atoms of the same element are alike in all respects. Should I pick an atom of calcium here, pick an atom of arsenium at any other place, by the time I'm bringing it together, they must be alike in all respects. They must be alike in all respects. The next is that atoms combine in small ratio to form compound molecules, to form compound atoms known as molecule. For instance, if I have sodium chloride salt, my sodium chloride salt will be formed as a result of sodium atom combining electrovalently, so it with chlorine atom to form my sodium chloride salt. Another thing is that chemical changes result as a result of combination and separation of atoms. Chemical changes occur as a result of combination and separation of atoms. The last but not the least is that atoms can neither be created nor destroyed. Yeah, atoms can neither be created nor destroyed. Although there are modifications to this, Dalton's atomic theory, but for the sake of biochemistry, which is our focus here, we'll be sticking with Dalton atomic theory and we'll build on that. So briefly, let's look at what a cell is. We just look at atom, which is believed to be the smallest indivisible particle, the smallest that can ever occur in the inorganic world. You believe with me that the smallest that can ever occur in the inorganic world is the atom. So let's look at the organic and the living world. What's the smallest that can ever exist? That's a cell. And let's go by the definition that a cell is the basic. There are keywords in defining what a cell is, and I want you to jot down the keyword because they are so fundamental to what a cell is. There's no way you will work as a biochemist without paying obeisance to a cell and what a cell is. So a cell is the basic, fundamental, structural, and functional unit of all living organisms. It is also the membrane-bound entity that contains all the molecule of life. Now you draw your cell, you give it a nucleus, you give it a mitochondria, you give it this is your plasma membrane, this is your nucleus, this is your mitochondria, you may give it ribosomes, you may give it Golgi apparatus, and so many other organelles that you can find in your cell. But as simple as this is the basic, fundamental, and structural, including the functional unit of all living organisms. Now, this is membrane-bound. It is a membrane-bound entity, and inside this membrane-bound entity is all the molecules that will sustain life. That's why I say a cell is the membrane-bound entity that contains all the molecules of life. So let's look at the cell theory. There are foremost scientists who has given us the summary of what a cell is and what is expected of a cell. First and foremost is that all living things or all living organisms are made up of cells. And that is true. No matter the level of organization, be it at the cellular level, be it at the tissue level, or whatsoever level it may be, either it's occurring in unison as a single unit, single cell organism, or as complex cell that is composed together or that is differentiated to form various activity. No matter how small, no matter how simple or how complex the cell may be, all living thing or the living thing may be, all living things are made up of cells. Secondly, the cell is the structural and functional unit of all life forms, like we said in the definition. The next is that all cells come from pre-existing cells. All cells come from pre-existing cells, and that's where you come into the world of your mitosis and your meiosis, which means a cell will not erupt spontaneously on its own. You have to have a cell to have another daughter cell. The daughter cell grows to give birth to another daughter cell, and that's how continuity continues. Are we together in the living world. The next is that cell contain hereditary information passed from cell to cell during division. Yeah, because every living organism will produce a copy, a faithful copy of itself. So there must be molecules, there must be mechanisms that chaperones or that coordinate the replication of cell, and this is thoroughly supervised by biomolecules that make sure, in this case I'm talking about your nucleic acid, which we will still explain in the course of this lecture, that there are biomolecules that chaperones or that coordinates the hereditary information as they are passed from one parent to the other and to the progeny, just like from the ancestor to the progeny, how genetic information are passed. So I'll go through that again. Cells contain hereditary information, and I said that is your nucleic acid passed from cell to cell during division or during reproduction. That another is that all cells are basically alike in chemical composition. Yeah. So if I bring a human cell and I bring a cell from, let's say, E. coli, I will be seeing that at the biochemical level there are similarities between the two cells, and this forms a good focus point in what biochemistry exactly study. Jacques Manod quoted long time ago that what is true of E. coli is true of elephants. That is at the biochemical level, because by the time you're looking at an E. coli cell and you're looking at as big as an elephant is, you're looking at an elephant cell, you notice similarities. You notice a lot, and the similarities go a long way because it traces back to evolution. We treat that when we are looking at our evolution, our foundation of biochemistry. The last but not the least on our cell theory is that all energy flow and metabolisms of life occur in a cell. All energy flow and metabolism of life occurs in a cell. So let's come to the universe as a whole. To us biochemists, what makes up the universe? How did the universe come to be? There are a lot of explanations about what must have occurred to surge up the universe. We have the religious explanation, philosophical explanation. As a matter of fact, each ethnic group has their explanation, and the scientific world, we have our explanation. For the purpose of this biochemistry, we'll be sticking with the Bang Theorem, which explains that the universe arose about 15 billion years ago. Wow, that's long. As a result of cataclysmic eruption of hot energy-rich subatomic particles, which releases simple elements and simpler subatomic particle, which condenses to form the planetary body. This is what we are trying to say there. Now, the Big Bang Theory explains that subatomic particles erupted, or they collided together. It's just that something that it's destructive, but at the same time it's formative. Just you have subatomic particle boom erupting together. Now the eruption of subatomic particle is definitely going to create heat energy. Now, and the eruption is going to, the heat energy will be used to divide the subatomic particle into even smaller subatomic particle. And the Big Bang Theory claims that simple elements of Earth, such as hydrogen, must have evolved as a result of this cataclysmic collision. Now, the cataclysmic collision now creates simpler subatomic particle, which is believed to now condense altogether, and it is believed that it is this condensation that forms the planetary body. This is what we are trying to explain there. So the Big Bang Theorem explains that there was cataclysmic eruption, subatomic particle, eruption, now this eruption led to simple element plus simpler subatomic particles. Now plus heat, we have to mention that, plus heat. Now it was discovered that this condenses to form stars. Now, some stars are believed to be big enough to explode as supernovas. Now, some stars explode as supernovas. Now, the explosion of stars as supernovas now is believed to now condense. So explosion. Now, expansion also occur. Expansion, and it is followed by contraction. And this is what is believed to now form the planetary bodies. As we have it today. Now, having explained this, we just see that all these events occurred about 15 billion years ago. Now, take a pause. If life, if the universe arose by this sketch drawn up here about 15 billion years ago, now you notice that everything here is inorganic. Inorganic subatomic particle will definitely be inorganic. Simple elements, your hydrogen is inorganic. The planetary bodies, the star, the earth, as you see it today, is inorganic. Now, there comes the question, where did life come from? Where did life? That's a question, that where did life come from? Because you remember that in our cell theory, we said all cell come from pre-existing cell. Omnicellular, acellular. That's what the Latin says. So where did the cell come from here? Now, take a pause, take a chill pill, we'll explain that. Now, get this and understand that life arose about 3.8 billion years ago with how there exists an entity that has the ability to harness energy. One, that's the first thing that must have occurred in the surging up of life. An entity surged up from this. Now, that entity has the ability to harness energy. Now, it also has the ability to integrate simple earth elements into complex biomolecules. But how did that occur? How? We'll explain that when we are looking at our evolutionary foundation of biochemistry. We have a lot to learn on this platform, because we've been taking a glimpse at the work of Alexandra Ioparin. We'll be looking at the chemical evolution that must have surged up to create the first living cell. So, for introduction's sake, we get to the detail, but for introduction's sake, just keep that question in your heart: that how did life surge up from this sketch of non-living activity? This activity of non-living thing that happened there. So I said life surged up from an entity that just by itself has the ability to harness energy from its environment. Now it uses that energy to integrate simple inorganic elements. It now uses that element. It uses that energy to integrate those elements until those elements surge up life. We will explain that comprehensively. So this question that I asked has been facing biochemists for ages, that how did life arose from mere integration lifeless biomolecules? So from there, with that question in our hearts, that how must have life surged up from this activity, that takes us with that question in our heart, that takes us to the definition of what biochemistry is. I believe we are together. Let's go. Biochemistry as a course, let's define it now, is the study of how collections of inorganic and inanimate molecules integrate and relate together to surge up life, to breed life, to maintain life, and to regulate life. I'll go through that again. Biochemistry is the study of how collections of inorganic and inanimate biomolecules integrate together, relate together, to surge up life, breed life, maintain life, and regulate life. For instance, carbon is carbon. You remember carbon and its compound. Yeah, I did that when I was in SS1. Yeah, in those days in my secondary school. Carbon as its compound. Carbon has inorganic nature. It's an element. You see it on your periodic table. Okay, so you know that your carbon can exist as either amorphous or in the crystalline state. That's when you talk about your diamond, you talk about graphite. Now, look at it in your mind. How did this same carbon now integrate with other elements such as hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, nitrogen to surge up life? All right, so that's what brings the definition that how collections of inorganic elements, for instance, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, nitrogen, how do they integrate together? In what order do they integrate together, and how do they integrate together to surge up life, to breed life, to maintain life, and to regulate life? Let's give it another definition. Biochemistry defines in molecular terms the structure, mechanisms, and chemical processes shared by all living organisms. That is to say, you look at living organisms, bring it together from the simplest to the complex. Now look at it in molecular terms. What are the structure? What are the mechanisms? What are the chemical processes they share? Now you now explain this down. You use it to explain the logic of life by explaining that same molecular background. I'll go through that again. Biochemistry describes in molecular terms the structure, the mechanisms, the chemical processes shared by living organisms, explaining the organizing logic of life by explaining its molecular background. Now, we just concluded the explanation that truly it is the integration and ordering of living organism the integration and ordering of inorganic elements that surged up life. Now, despite the fact that integration of inorganic compounds, integration of inorganic elements formed life, which we will explain better in chemical evolution. Despite that fact that it was the integration of inorganic elements that surged up life, there are still characteristics of living things that makes it distinct from the inorganic world. I'll go through that again. Despite the fact that it is the integration of inorganic elements that surged up life, there are characteristics which living organisms biochemically exhibit that makes it distinct from the inorganic world. Are we together? So let's look at the biochemical relevance. Pardon me. So now we are looking at the biochemically relevant characteristics of living thing, which makes it easily differentiable, which makes it easily identifiable apart, which makes it easy for us to identify it separately from the inorganic world. First is that in living organism you see a high degree of chemical complexity and microscopic organization. You see a high degree of chemical complexity and microscopic organization. What do we mean by that? In a single cell, like I have here, this is just a caricature of what a cell exactly looks like. A cell is far more complex than this. Now, if I pick, let's say this mitochondria, if I pick this mitochondria, and I look, if I am able to remove this mitochondria from this cell, I bust this cell open, and I centrifuge it, and I bring out this mitochondria. Now, this mitochondria, by the time I look at it this mitochondria will look naturally simple to you, but by the time I look at this under a more powerful microscope, then I begin to see the inner structure. Then you see the matrix, you see the crystal, you see the intermembrane layer. Now, by the time I look at each of these, even to a more molecular level, you'll be amazed at what you see, that as simple as this looks in a cell, it is composed or it is formed as a result of integration of massive number of chemicals, massive number of biomolecules. That is what we mean by each cell or each living entity has a high degree of chemical complexity. That's not the same with mitochondria, it's the same with plasma, it's the same with all the organelles you found in your cell. And another thing is that every cell has a high degree of microscopic organization. For instance, you can imagine the number of cells that integrate to form you. Talking about trillions of cells here. So let's move to the next point, is that every living organism has mechanism for extracting, for transforming, and for using energy from its environment. The truth of the matter is that every living organism requires energy for its activity. Talk about activities such as reproduction, activities such as responding to the environment, activities such as growth, activities such as homeostasis and the rest requires energy. So a living entity, a living cell, a living organism must have a mechanism of extracting energy from its environment and using that energy for its own benefit. It harnesses energy from the environment and converts that energy for its own use, uses it to optimize its own adaptation and growth. Let's continue. Another point is that all living entity has a defined function for each of their components. I'll go through that again. By the time you see an organism, like I said earlier in the first point, that organism is composed of high degree of chemical complexity and high degree of microscopic organization. Despite this, each of the organelle, each of the components that you see in a cell has a defined function. For instance, you now see the nucleus doing the work of a mitochondria. Neither will you see the mitochondria doing the work of a lysosome. Neither will you see a lysosome doing the work of a plasma membrane. No, there is a defined function for each and every of the organelle or entity you see inside the cell. And another thing is that despite the fact that there is a defined function for each entity you see inside the cell, there is a coordinated interrelationship between them. There's a coordinated and regulated interaction between the entity you see in the cell. Let's move on. Another is that all living organism has the ability for accurate self-replication. Like I said earlier on, a living organism must have the ability to create or to produce a faithful copy of itself. So that's one of the things that separates a living thing from a non-living thing. A living organism must have mechanisms for accurate and faithful self-replication. Another is that a living organism must have mechanism for sensing and responding. It must sense and it must respond to alterations from its environment. It must have mechanisms to sense changes and to adapt by either an internal change or an external change. A living entity must have the ability to sense it and the ability to make changes such that it just adapts together to that change for the time that change lasts. Together. So a living cell will not just die, maybe because of a slight increase in temperature, will not just die as a result of just a slight increase or decrease in pH or a slight increase or decrease in humidity. A living organism or a living entity must have the ability to adapt to environmental changes, at least to a great extent. Now, another is that a living organism must have a living organism must have an history of evolutionary change. All living organism must have history of evolutionary change, because evolution is a concept on its own in biochemistry, which we will explain later. We're going to evolutionary foundation of biochemistry and we explain this. So let's look at the foundations of biochemistry. So far, we have just laid the foundation, and I believe that the foundation we've laid so far will remain in your heart. I believe that during the course of the lecture, you are making your jottings, you are putting things down, because from this point on, we'll be moving on to foundations of biochemistry. We'll be looking at the 5 foundations on which biochemistry is laid. We'll be looking at those foundations. So we are starting with the biological or the cellular foundation. Thank you.